neither the Army nor the War Relocation Authority relished the idea of taking men, women, and children from their homes, their shops, and their farms. So the military and civilian agencies alike determined to do the job as a democracy should, with real consideration for the people involved.
And I knew that if I did not tell my story, then my 4 nieces and my 3 children would really not hear what actually happened to us. We were shocked to see covered Army trucks and soldiers with bayonets on their rifles. I couldn't get over the notion that we were going to be taken away and shot. When I got off, I couldn't believe what I saw. Soldiers with machine guns stood in 20-foot-high guard towers situated at strategic points along the perimeter of a huge camp. The area was encased in steel wire fencing topped by 3 rows of barbed wire. Black tar-papered barracks were laid out in regimented form along the flat terrain. You know, they didn't call us citizens because it's illegal to imprison citizens without due process.
But they did imprison U.S. citizens without due process. Over 110,000 of them who happened to be of Japanese ancestry. These American citizens were uprooted from their homes, taken away from their businesses, and sent to places like this. One of these citizens was my great-uncle John Shimokawa. Uncle John was a dental student in California at the beginning of World War II. He was rounded up, along with all other Japanese Americans on the West Coast, and sent to an internment camp far away from his home in California. I traveled to this relocation camp to learn more about my uncle's experience. This camp in Manzanar is over 200 miles away from Los Angeles. There were 10 camps like this in remote locations where Japanese Americans, like my Uncle John, were confined. 2 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066 that authorized the removal of over 110,000 Japanese Americans from their homes on the West Coast. More than 2/3 were American-born U.S. citizens. Over 10,000 men, women, and children spent several years of their lives here at this camp. They brought with them only what they could carry from their homes. I wanted to understand how this happened to Uncle John, and I wanted to learn what protects us from this happening again. Experts have tried to explain why this took place.
Well, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, which had been a sneak attack, don't let anybody tell you that there wasn't a lot of fear on the West Coast at that time, because they had barrage balloons up in San Francisco. A Japanese sub was sighted off Santa Barbara. And so there was real fear that the Japanese had also attacked the West Coast. But the urging for the detention of the Japanese came from the civilians saying, we don't have time to find out whether any of these people individually are disloyal. We've got to simply intern all of them.
And by 1944, one of the most interesting parts of this is it was also apparent that there had never been a basis for holding these people. Never. And at the time, the man in charge, General DeWitt, knew there was no basis. He had been told that by J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover told him the FBI doesn't want these people moved. We know who the spies are, and they aren't it.
The Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment is supposed to balance the power of the government against the rights of its citizens. Due process did not protect the Japanese Americans during the internment. Substantive due process requires that the government live up to a high standard if it tries to take away fundamental rights like life, liberty, or property. Procedural due process means that the government can't take away your rights without an adequate notice and a hearing before a neutral judge. The government took people to court who resisted the internment. Those trials, though, did not provide procedural due process because the government didn't present its evidence fairly. One example is a citizen named Fred Korematsu, who is about my uncle's age when he was arrested for refusing the internment orders. Mr. Korematsu argued that it was illegal to imprison him in the camps.
In 1942, Fred Korematsu boldly opposed the forced internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. After being convicted for failing to report for relocation, Mr. Korematsu took his case all the way to the Supreme Court. The High Court ruled against him. But 39 years later, he had his conviction overturned in federal court, empowering tens of thousands of Japanese Americans and giving him what he said he wanted most of all, the chance to feel like an American once again.
Fred Korematsu fought back and stood up for his constitutional rights. His daughter has dedicated her life to educating people about her father's legacy. She spoke with me about her father when I met with her recently.
The Japanese Americans had to be put into the internment camps without any due process. There was no hearings, there were no trials. My father would want students to know that it was a horrible experience. He felt it was an unjust act, by the government. And his question in his mind was, am I an American or am I not?
I finished my trip to Manzanar by visiting the memorial site that commemorated the lives and the liberties that were lost there. The Japanese characters on this obelisk say that it is a monument to console the souls of the dead. For the living, it is a reminder that the Constitution has its weaknesses. We all need to be protective of our civil liberties for times when the government decides to set them aside. After 2 years in the camps, my uncle served in the army and became a successful dentist. Fred Korematsu received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1998 for his lifelong commitment to our constitutional rights. These stories from the internment camps remind us how vital due process is for protecting our freedom.